30 years after that fateful day at Walter Reed, the Harrington-Chen Institute had become a global leader in trauma recovery. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, a nurse talking to an unconscious patient when others had given up, had blossomed into a comprehensive approach to healing that had transformed countless lives. On a bright spring morning, Eliza stood at the window of their office, watching as medical professionals from around the world gathered in the Institute's courtyard. They had come for the annual Presence Protocol Conference, a week-long immersion in the methodology she and James had pioneered. At 72, Eliza's hair had turned completely silver, but her posture remained straight, her eyes clear and observant behind elegant glasses. "They're here from 27 countries this year," James said, joining her at the window. At 75, he moved more slowly now, the cumulative effects of his injuries more pronounced with age, but his voice remained strong, his mind sharp. "Including 3 doctors from that field hospital in Yemen where you implemented the protocol during the crisis last year." Eliza smiled, leaning slightly against his shoulder. Full circle again. They were skeptical at first, too busy trying to save lives to worry about talking to unconscious patients. Until they saw the results, James finished. He checked his watch. "We should head down. The opening ceremony starts in 20 minutes. As they made their way through the Institute's corridors, they passed walls lined with research papers, photographs, and testimonials, the documented evidence of 3 decades of work. Staff members greeted them with warm respect, many stopping to introduce visiting physicians or researchers who had come to learn from the founders themselves. In the main auditorium, they took their places on stage as the Institute's current director, Dr. Maya Rodriguez, once a young lieutenant who had approached them at the dedication of the original trauma center, welcomed the assembled crowd. "It is my great honor to introduce the pioneers whose work brings us together today," Dr. Rodriguez said. Their journey began not in a research laboratory or a university classroom, but in a hospital room where one nurse refused to accept that an unconscious patient was beyond reaching, and one wounded warrior found his way back through the darkness. As James and Eliza stood to approach the podium, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Medical professionals from 6 continents, representing disciplines from neurosurgery to psychiatric care, united in recognition of what these 2 individuals had contributed to the understanding of healing. James squeezed Eliza's hand before they separated to take their positions at twin podiums. They had developed a tradition over the years of beginning these conferences by sharing the story that had started it all, not the clinical details or the research outcomes, but the human experience that had inspired a medical revolution. 30 years ago, James began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I was carried into Walter Reed National Military Medical Center with injuries that should have killed me. The medical team saved my body, but it was a young nurse named Eliza Chen who saved my spirit. I was new to the trauma unit," Eliza continued, picking up the narrative they had shared countless times. "The other doctors and nurses saw a patient with catastrophic injuries and minimal chances of meaningful recovery. I saw a person waiting to be called back to life. They alternated, weaving the story together as they had woven their lives, each adding details, perspectives, and insights that the other couldn't provide. They spoke of those early days when Eliza had sat beside James's bed, talking for hours when there was no response. They described the moment when he first moved his fingers, the day he opened his eyes, the gradual return to consciousness that defied medical expectations. And then they reached the part of the story that still moved them both, even after 30 years of telling it. "Before I was transferred to rehabilitation," James said, "I insisted on standing. Not because I was medically ready, but because I needed to do something that could only be done on my feet. I helped him stand," Eliza continued, "against medical advice and my better judgment. He was trembling with the effort, barely able to support his own weight. And then," James said, his voice softening with the memory, "I saluted her. It was the only way I could think to express what her presence had meant during those dark days when I couldn't speak, couldn't move, but could somehow still hear her voice calling me back." The auditorium was silent, hundreds of medical professionals leaning forward, captivated by the personal story behind the protocol they had come to study. That salute changed everything, Eliza said. Not just for us, but for how trauma care would be practiced for the next 3 decades. It provided visible, undeniable evidence that patients we consider non-responsive may be far more aware than we realize, and that human connection can reach places that medical procedures cannot. From that moment, James continued, grew the Presence Protocol, the systematic integration of consistent verbal engagement, personal connection, and identity affirmation into standard trauma care. What began as one nurse talking to one patient has now been implemented in thousands of facilities worldwide, with documented improvements in recovery outcomes across all demographics. They proceeded to outline the conference agenda, the latest research findings, and the new applications being explored in fields from pediatric care to geriatrics. But as they spoke, many in the audience found themselves drawn not just to the clinical information, but to the palpable connection between these two individuals whose personal journey had transformed medical practice. After the opening session, as attendees dispersed to various workshops and presentations, James and Eliza made their way to a small garden at the heart of the institute. This private space, accessible only to staff and patients, had been designed as a place of reflection and healing. At its center stood a simple bronze sculpture, 2 hands reaching toward each other, almost but not quite touching, the space between them representing the journey from isolation to connection. They sat on a bench beneath a flowering cherry tree, taking a moment of quiet before their next presentation. After 30 years of marriage and partnership, they had developed a comfortable silence, a shared peace that required no words. "I had a letter yesterday," Eliza said finally. "From that young medic in the Kiev Field Hospital, the one who implemented the protocol during the siege last winter." "How is she doing?" James asked. "Better," she said. Talking to those wounded soldiers, even when they couldn't respond, helped her as much as it helped them. Gave her purpose when everything seemed hopeless. Eliza paused, looking at the sculpture. "She's starting a training program for other field medics." James nodded, understanding the significance. "The ripples continue." "They do," Eliza agreed. "Sometimes I wonder how far they'll reach, long after we're gone." James took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture as familiar as breathing. "That's the beauty of it, isn't it? We'll never know the full impact. Every patient who recovers because of the protocol will go on to touch other lives. Every medical professional who learns these methods will treat hundreds, maybe thousands of patients over their career." "A legacy beyond measurement," Eliza murmured. They sat together as cherry blossoms drifted down around them, 2 people who had found each other across the divide of trauma and built something extraordinary from that connection. Their personal story, of a wounded warrior and the nurse who called him back, had become medical history, their names linked forever with a revolution in trauma care. But in this quiet moment, they were simply James and Eliza, husband and wife, partners in work and life, 2 souls who had discovered that sometimes the greatest healing happens not through medical intervention but through the courage to reach across darkness and say, "I am here. You are not alone. Come back." As they prepared to return to the conference, to share their knowledge with another generation of healers, James paused and turned to Eliza. With the formality that had never quite left his military bearing, he raised his hand in a perfect salute, the gesture that had started everything 30 years before. Eliza returned the salute, her eyes bright with shared memory and continuing purpose. It had become their private ritual, their personal acknowledgement of the journey they had traveled together, from a hospital room where doctors had laughed at a new nurse until a wounded SEAL commander saluted her, to a world where their names were synonymous with compassionate, connection-based healing. And as they walked back toward the auditorium, where hundreds of medical professionals waited to learn from their experience, they moved with the quiet confidence of people who knew that their work would continue long after they were gone, in hospitals and clinics around the world, wherever one human being reached out to another across the void of trauma and refused to let go. For in the end, that was the true legacy of the Harrington-Chen Protocol, not just improved recovery statistics or advanced medical techniques, but the profound understanding that healing is, at its core, an act of connection, one voice calling to another through darkness, one hand reaching out when all seems lost, one heart believing in return when science suggests surrender. And in that understanding lay a truth as old as humanity itself, rediscovered and reaffirmed through their journey, that we heal best not in isolation but in relationship, not through technology alone but through human touch, not by medical miracle but by the everyday magic of being truly seen, truly heard, and truly called back to life. As the Harrington-Chen Institute celebrated its 35th anniversary, the medical world had fully embraced what had once been considered an unconventional approach. The Presence Protocol was now standard curriculum in medical and nursing schools worldwide, its principles integrated into everything from emergency response to long-term care. James and Eliza, now in their late 70s, had gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the Institute, entrusting its future to the capable hands of those they had mentored. They still participated in special events and occasionally consulted on particularly challenging cases, but they had reached the stage of life where their greatest contribution was in the wisdom they had accumulated rather than the hours they could work. On a quiet autumn afternoon, they sat together on the porch of their home overlooking the Chesapeake Bay, watching sailboats drift across the water. Time had gentled them both. James's once commanding presence now carried a thoughtful serenity, while Eliza's quiet determination had mellowed into a peaceful wisdom. Their hands, weathered by age and marked by decades of service, remained intertwined as they had been for so many years. "Dr. Rodriguez called this morning," Eliza mentioned, her voice still clear though softer than in her younger days. "The WHO has officially adopted the protocol as part of their global emergency response standards." James nodded, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes where the scar from his long-ago injury disappeared into silver hair. "That means every disaster zone, every refugee camp, every field hospital will implement it." "Full circle," Eliza murmured, the phrase that had become something of a mantra throughout their journey. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the changing light on the water. After so many years together, they had developed a communication that often transcended words, a shared understanding built on decades of partnership in work and life. "I've been thinking," James said finally, "about that first day you talked to me. When I couldn't respond, couldn't move, but somehow heard your voice through the darkness." Eliza turned to him, curious. Even after all these years, they occasionally discovered new details about those early days, memories that had surfaced or perspectives that had shifted with time. "What about it?" she asked. "I never told you exactly what I heard," he said. "What words actually reached me first?" Eliza raised an eyebrow. "After 35 years, you're just now mentioning this?" James chuckled. "It never seemed important until recently. But I was reading through some of the patient testimonials for the anniversary publication, and it made me remember." He shifted slightly to face her, his movements careful but deliberate. "It wasn't when you were talking about my medical condition or the treatment plan. It wasn't even when you were telling me about your experiences in conflict zones." "What was it, then?" Eliza asked softly. "You were adjusting my blanket, I think. And you said, 'The sunrise was beautiful this morning, Commander. All pink and gold over the Potomac. The kind of day that reminds you the world is still turning, still beautiful, still waiting for you to come back to it.'" James's eyes held hers. "That's what reached me first, not medical information, not encouragement to fight, but the simple sharing of beauty. The reminder that there was still a world worth returning to." Eliza's eyes misted slightly. "I don't even remember saying that." "You probably said dozens of similar things," James acknowledged. "But that's what broke through first, your humanity, not your nursing skills. Your willingness to share something personal, something beautiful, with someone who couldn't respond." He reached up to touch the silver pendant that still hung around her neck, worn smooth by decades of being held in moments of challenge or doubt. "That's what the protocol really is, at its heart. Not just talking to patients, but truly sharing life with them, even when they can't reciprocate." As the sun began to set, painting the bay in shades of pink and gold reminiscent of that long-ago sunrise, they were interrupted by the arrival of a car in their driveway. Moments later, their granddaughter Maya, named after Dr. Rodriguez, who had become like family over the years, bounded up the steps, her medical school textbooks in hand. "Grandma, Grandpa," she greeted them, bending to kiss each on the cheek. "Sorry I'm late. Clinical rotations ran over." "No apology needed," Eliza assured her. "We're just enjoying the sunset." Maya settled into a chair across from them, her young face alight with the enthusiasm of someone discovering her calling. At 24, she was the image of Eliza in her younger days, the same determined eyes, the same compassionate presence. "How was your trauma rotation?" James asked, always interested in her medical education. "Amazing," Maya replied. "We had a patient today, motorcycle accident, severe head trauma, minimal brain activity according to the initial scans. The attending was discussing organ donation options with the team." She paused, a small smile playing at her lips. "Then I noticed something no one else caught." "What was that?" Eliza asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "His heart rate changed when his wife spoke," Maya said. "Just slightly, but consistently. I asked if I could implement the Harrington-Chen Protocol, and the attending agreed, probably just to humor me." James and Eliza exchanged a glance, hearing in her story the echo of their own. "I sat with him for an hour after my shift," Maya continued. "Just talking, explaining what was happening, playing his favorite music that his wife had mentioned. The nurses thought I was wasting my time." Her smile widened. "Until he squeezed my hand during the evening assessment. The doctors were surprised, I imagine," James said, his eyes twinkling. "Shocked is more like it," Maya laughed. "The attending actually said, 'I guess there's something to that Harrington-Chen voodoo after all.'" Eliza shook her head, amused. "Some things never change. There will always be skeptics. Until they see the results," James and Maya said in unison, completing what had become a family saying. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared over the bay, the three generations sat together, sharing stories of healing and hope. Maya spoke of her plans to specialize in trauma medicine, perhaps even to work internationally as her grandmother had done. James and Eliza listened with quiet pride, seeing in their granddaughter the continuation of the work they had begun so many years ago. Later, after Maya had departed with promises to return for Sunday dinner, James and Eliza stood together at the railing of their porch, looking out at the night sky reflected in the dark waters of the bay. "She's carrying it forward," Eliza said softly. "Not just the protocol, but the understanding behind it." "She has your heart," James replied. "And your stubborn determination to see the person behind the patient." Eliza smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "And your courage to stand up for what she believes in, even when others doubt." They remained there for a long moment, two people who had transformed trauma care through the simple, revolutionary act of believing in connection when others saw only medical metrics. Their journey had taken them from a hospital room where doctors laughed at a new nurse, to international recognition, to this peaceful moment watching their legacy continue through the next generation. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "when I was lying in that hospital bed, unable to move or speak, I never imagined this future. I was just trying to find my way back to the next moment, the next breath. And I was just doing what felt right," Eliza added. "Talking to you like you could hear me, because the alternative, believing you were beyond reaching, was unacceptable." "That's always been your gift," James said, turning to face her. "Seeing possibilities where others see only limitations. Believing in return when science suggests surrender." In the gentle darkness, with the sound of waves lapping at the shore below, he straightened his aging frame and raised his hand in the salute that had become their most meaningful gesture. Eliza returned it, her eyes bright with shared memory and continuing love. It was the same salute that had silenced a hospital room 35 years earlier, that had changed the course of trauma medicine, that had launched a journey neither of them could have imagined on that day when a wounded SEAL commander had found the strength to honor the nurse who had called him back from darkness. But now it carried additional layers of meaning, acknowledgement of a lifetime shared, recognition of challenges overcome, celebration of a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. It was no longer just about respect between a patient and a caregiver, but about the profound connection that had grown between two people who had discovered that healing, at its deepest level, is an act of love. As they turned to go inside, arm in arm in the familiar rhythm they had developed over decades together, they carried with them the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their story, which had begun in crisis and pain, had blossomed into something that brought healing to countless others around the world. And somewhere in that story lay a truth as simple as it was profound, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to believe in another person's return when all evidence suggests they are lost, that sometimes the most powerful medicine is not found in technology or pharmaceuticals but in the unwavering presence of one human being with another, and that sometimes, against all odds and expectations, a voice in the darkness can guide us home. 40 years after that fateful day at Walter Reed, the Harrington-Chen Institute hosted a special ceremony. It wasn't an anniversary celebration or a medical conference, but something more personal and poignant, a memorial service for Captain James Harrington, who had passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Eliza by his side until the very end. The Institute's auditorium was filled beyond capacity. Military personnel in dress uniforms stood alongside medical professionals from around the world. Former patients whose lives had been transformed by the protocol sat next to researchers who had dedicated their careers to expanding its applications. In the front row, Eliza sat surrounded by family, their children, grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren, the newest just 6 months old. At 80, Eliza's frame had grown more delicate, but her posture remained straight, her eyes clear behind silver-framed glasses. The seal trident pendant James had given her decades ago still hung around her neck, now accompanied by his wedding ring on a matching chain. Dr. Maya Rodriguez, now the Institute's director, approached the podium. "We gather today not only to mourn the loss of Captain James Harrington, but to celebrate a life that transformed how we understand healing. His journey from wounded warrior to pioneering advocate changed medicine forever." She paused, her voice softening. But those who knew him best understood that his greatest legacy wasn't the protocol that bears his name, but the countless lives touched by his unwavering belief that no one is beyond reaching, no one is beyond return. Throughout the service, speakers shared memories and stories, military colleagues recounting his courage in combat, medical professionals describing his passionate advocacy, former patients testifying to the impact of his personal visits during their darkest hours. Each story added another dimension to the portrait of a man whose life had been defined not by the injuries that nearly claimed him, but by what he chose to build from that experience. When it was time for Eliza to speak, a hush fell over the gathering. She walked slowly to the podium, carrying a small wooden box. For a moment, she simply looked out at the assembled faces, taking in the living testament to the work she and James had accomplished together. 40 years ago, she began, her voice soft but steady, "I was a young nurse who refused to accept that an unconscious patient was beyond hearing, beyond connection, beyond hope. James was that patient, a wounded SEAL commander given little chance of meaningful recovery." She smiled slightly. "We proved them wrong." A murmur of gentle laughter rippled through the audience. "Many of you know our story, how I talked to him when others had given up, how he fought his way back to consciousness against all medical predictions, how he stood and saluted me before being transferred to rehabilitation. That moment changed both our lives and, eventually, trauma care worldwide." Eliza opened the wooden box she had brought to the podium. "What many of you don't know is that James kept this all these years." She lifted out a small, worn notebook. "It's the journal I kept during those early days at his bedside. I wrote down everything I said to him, every observation, every small sign of response that the doctors dismissed as reflexive movement." She turned the pages gently. "After we were married, James asked if he could read it. He said he wanted to understand those lost weeks from my perspective. When he finished, he wrote a response on the final page, a message I'd like to share with you today." Eliza turned to the last page and read. "To the voice that called me back. When I was lost in darkness, you spoke of light. When I was trapped in silence, you filled it with meaning. When others saw only what was broken, you saw what remained whole. You didn't just save my life, you showed me how to live it with purpose. Whatever good I have done in this world began with your refusal to let me go. For that, and for every moment since, I remain eternally grateful. With all my love. James. Eliza closed the journal, her eyes bright with unshed tears. That was James, always giving credit to others when the strength was truly his own. The truth is, we saved each other. And together, we discovered something profound about healing that has since been validated by decades of research and thousands of patient outcomes, that human connection can reach places medicine alone cannot touch. She looked out at the gathering, her gaze taking in the military personnel, the medical professionals, the family members. James believed that every life has purpose, that every person deserves to be called back from darkness, that no one should face their greatest challenges alone. He lived that belief every day, not just through the protocol that bears our names, but through countless small acts of presence and connection that never made headlines or research papers. Eliza placed the journal back in its box. In our last conversation, James asked me to tell you all something. He said, remind them that the protocol isn't really about talking to unconscious patients. It's about recognizing the humanity in each person, even when that humanity is hidden by injury or illness or circumstance. It's about having the courage to reach across the void when there's no guarantee of response. It's about believing in return when all evidence suggests it's impossible. She paused, gathering herself. James returned to me 40 years ago against all medical expectations. Now he has gone where I cannot follow, at least, not yet. But I take comfort in knowing that his legacy continues in every hospital room where a caregiver sits beside a patient others have given up on, in every battlefield where a medic speaks words of hope to a wounded soldier, in every rehabilitation center where therapists celebrate the smallest signs of progress as victories. As Eliza returned to her seat, her granddaughter Maya, now Dr. Maya Chen Williams, a trauma specialist following in her grandparents' footsteps, stepped forward. In her hands, she carried a folded American flag and a small velvet box. Before my grandfather passed, Maya said, he asked that his seal trident be presented to the Institute, to be displayed alongside the original journal my grandmother kept during his recovery. These items represent the beginning of what would become the Harrington-Chen Protocol, one patient, one caregiver, and the connection that transformed trauma medicine. She presented the flag to Eliza, then opened the velvet box to reveal the seal trident that James had worn throughout his naval career. But he left specific instructions about his second trident, the one he carried as a spare throughout his service. Maya turned to face her grandmother. He asked that it be given to you, Grandma, to accompany the one he gave you 40 years ago. One to represent your past together, one to represent your future. As Eliza accepted the second trident, a single tear slipped down her cheek. For 40 years, she had worn the first as a reminder of their beginning. Now she would wear the second as a promise of their eventual reunion. After the service, as attendees gathered in the Institute's garden for the reception, Eliza found a quiet moment alone by the bronze sculpture of two hands reaching toward each other. She stood there, lost in thought, until she felt a presence beside her. Admiral Chen. A young Navy corpsman in dress uniform approached hesitantly. I'm sorry to intrude, ma'am. Not at all, Eliza assured him. And please, it's just Eliza now. I retired from active service many years ago. Yes, ma'am, I mean, Eliza. He seemed nervous. I just wanted to thank you personally. I was injured in an operation 3 years ago, traumatic brain injury, unresponsive for nearly a month. The doctors had started discussing long-term care options with my family. Eliza nodded, understanding immediately where his story was going. My nurse implemented the Harrington-Chen Protocol, he continued. She sat with me for hours, talking, playing music, reading letters from my family. I couldn't respond, but I heard everything. He paused, emotion evident in his voice. Captain Harrington visited me once during that time. I couldn't see him, but I recognized his voice from videos I'd watched during my training. He told me his story, your story, and said if he could find his way back, so could I. And you did, Eliza said softly. I did. The young corpseman straightened. When I was finally able to communicate, the first thing I asked was to meet the people who developed the protocol that saved me. They told me Captain Harrington visited all the military TBI patients at the institute. That he considered it his most important mission. He did, Eliza confirmed. Every week, without fail, until his health no longer permitted it. The corpseman hesitated, then said, I know this isn't the right time, with the memorial service and all, but I wanted you to know I've been accepted to medical school. I'm going to specialize in neurology, focus on traumatic brain injury. Because of you and Captain Harrington, I got a second chance. I want to make sure others do too. Eliza felt a wave of emotion, grief for James's absence mingled with profound gratitude for the continuing impact of their work. That would mean a great deal to him, she said. To both of us. After the young man left, Eliza remained by the sculpture, her fingers touching both trident pins now hanging around her neck. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a young nurse defying medical expectations to the co-creator of a methodology that had transformed trauma care worldwide. And at the heart of that journey was James, the patient who became her colleague, her partner, her husband, her fellow pioneer. The man who had stood on trembling legs to salute her 40 years ago, whose courage and determination had inspired countless others to find their own way back from darkness. Full circle, she whispered to herself, their shared phrase that had marked so many milestones. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Eliza straightened her shoulders and raised her hand in a perfect salute, a final tribute to the man who had changed her life and, through their work together, changed medicine itself. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of peace. James was gone, but their work continued, in every hospital implementing the protocol, in every caregiver refusing to give up on a patient others had written off, in every medical student learning that healing involves not just the body but the spirit. The doctors had laughed at the new nurse, until the wounded SEAL commander saluted her. And from that salute had grown not just a medical revolution, but a love story, a partnership, and a legacy that would continue to bring light to darkness long after both of them had passed from this world. For in the end, that was the true lesson of their journey, that healing is an act of connection, that presence has power beyond measurement, and that sometimes, the most important medical breakthrough isn't a new technology or procedure, but the simple, revolutionary belief that no one is beyond reaching, no one is beyond hearing, and no one is beyond return.